Hi, I'm John Green.
And I'm also John Green.
This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to look at one of the most infamous periods in U.S. history, the Jim Crow era, and the events that eventually lead up to the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Both the First and Second Great Migration brought many African Americans up north in search for new opportunities and a better life. However, not everyone could afford the trip. This left millions of African Americans stuck in the deep South that would soon become the stronghold for racism and intolerance. The day is September 15th, 1963. Children and adults alike are flocking to church, dressed in their Sunday formal clothes. At 10:22, an explosion is heard at the 16th Street Baptist Church. 4 members of the Ku Klux Klan, Thomas Edwin Blanton Jr., Herman Frank Cash, Robert Edward Chambliss, and Bobby Frank Cherry, planted 15 sticks of dynamite at the church, killing 4 girls and injuring dozens. And 2 months prior, civil rights leader Medgar Evers was found dead with a bullet through his heart. The killer was Brian D. La Beckwith Jr., who is another known white supremacist and KKK member. Now, Beckwith didn't plan out his murder too well. A few days prior to the assassination, Beckwith just walked around asking people where Evers lived. When he found out, his sniper recoiled and he hit himself in the eye. Quick to move, the police found his rifle and soon had Beckwith on trial. However, an all-white jury acquitted him guilty in no time. With segregation rampant and tensions at an all-time high, change was inevitable. But how did things get so bad in Birmingham?
Following the decision of Plessy versus Ferguson, Jim Crow laws were enacted to keep African Americans contained and restricted. White realtors could say no to aspiring black homeowners and create white suburbs where Africans lived in polluted cities. Voting polls, literacy tests, and a grandfather clause were all put in place to stop African Americans from voting.
But Mr. Green, didn't the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment protect the rights of African Americans?
Yes, but only in theory. These amendments were largely ignored, and African Americans were targeted anyway. Reconstruction was considered a massive failure, and when the North finally pulled out of the South in 1877, the KKK was freed to reign terror.
Let's talk about the Birmingham March. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC for short, was founded in 1957 by Martin Luther King Jr. The organization was formed as a group of Southern ministers who believed that the black church should get involved in the civil rights movement. The SCLC joined forces with the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights, or the ACMHR, and mainly hosted volunteer protests. These protests began in April 3rd of 1963. Man, these civil rights organizations' names just really roll off the tongue. Now let's take a look at the thought bubble. The protests in the Birmingham March included lunch counter sit-ins, marches on City Hall, and boycotts against the businesses of Birmingham that protested segregation laws. The most important thing about these protests were that they were non-violent. The genius of this plan revolves around the month that it was in. The march was originally planned to be during the month of March, which would have been a great pun since it would be a march in March. However, elections for mayor in Birmingham and the SCLC didn't want to accidentally have Eugene Bill Connor elected as mayor. But more on that lovely individual later. Anyway, the plan was postponed until April in order to threaten the town's economy around Easter, the second biggest boost in business for the town's economy next to Christmas. Eventually, the city obtained a state court injunction against the protests on April 10th, which MLK promptly disobeyed. On Good Friday, during one of his protests, King was arrested and put in jail. He was released on bail 10 days later on April 20th. Eventually, Birmingham thought enough was enough and had Burke Marshall help settle things. In return for no protests, Birmingham desegregated lunch counters, restrooms, drinking fountains, and dressing rooms. Black people could now be hired in stores as salesmen and clerks, and protesters were released from jail. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Now let's talk about our lad, Eugene Bull Connor.
One of the biggest challenges to the march in Birmingham was his police chief, Bull Connor. Eugene Bull Connor was a staunch white supremacist and Southern Democrat who was a proponent of racist social policies. Eugene Connor became a recurring National Convention delegate. He was part of the faction who walked out of the 1948 convention in protest of civil rights platforms and part of the Dixiecrat movement. Because of his public comments and resulting violence in his decrees, Connor became a known foe to the civil rights movement. He refused to provide police protection for the Freedom Riders in 1961 upon word that they would be besieged upon their arrival in Birmingham. Connor had also received entreaties from the community and human rights groups for an end to the racially motivated bombings in Birmingham, with cases unsolved. And there are allegations that he was part of a plan to murder one of the movement's most prominent leaders, Minister Fred Shuttlesworth. In response to the Birmingham walks, hundreds of student protesters were jailed. Connor eventually ordered authorities to attack peaceful protesters, many of whom were children, with water hoses and dogs. Images of this incident were broadcasted across the country and brought the civil rights movement into the public spotlight, thus speeding up integration in the city and galvanizing the likes of President John F. Kennedy, helping to set into motion the creation of the 1964 Civil Rights Act.
The Civil Rights Act was initially proposed by JFK, but was later signed by Lyndon B. Johnson. This act ended segregation in public places and banned employment discrimination due to race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was composed of 11 titles, which all expanded upon the 14th Amendment by requiring that the amendment be enforced at the level of the individual citizen. Title I addressed voting rights and eradicated unequal application of state voter registration for requirements for federal elections. Titles 2 through 5 desegregated public facilities such as hotels, restaurants, and places of entertainment. An example of the way this was upheld was in the Heart of Atlanta motel case. This case determined whether the Civil Rights Act had the power to enforce African American access to public accommodations. The Supreme Court upheld the act by ruling that Congress has the power to desegregate privately owned public accommodations.
Oh, it's time for the mystery document. The rules here are simple. I read the mystery document. If I'm wrong, I get shocked. Let's see if my knowledge of civil rights holds up. You may well ask, why direct action? Why sit-ins, marches, and so forth? Isn't negotiation a better path? You are quite right in calling for negotiation. Indeed, this is the very purpose of direct action. Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks so to dramatize the issue that it can no longer be ignored. My citing the creation of tension as part of the work of the nonviolent resistor may sound rather shocking, but I must confess that I'm not afraid of the word tension. I've earnestly opposed violent tension, but there's a type of constructive nonviolent tension which is necessary for growth. Let me take a second for this. Aha! It is a letter from Birmingham jail by Martin Luther King Jr. Huzzah! This letter was written after he was arrested for protesting in Birmingham after a ban was instituted. Clergymen use MLK's arrest as an excuse to attack the civil rights group as unwise and untimely. However, MLK wrote this in jail to refute the Alabama ministers who openly portrayed the protesters as being violent and irrational while attempting to make the Birmingham officials look just. This letter debunks the myth that African Americans utilize violence to attain what they want and reveals that they only wanted equality and justice. MLK, a black preacher himself, not only sees himself and as other African Americans as victims of racism, but also a victim of misunderstanding. Using his experiences as a black man targeted by racism, he argues that blacks must rise up against the injustice done to him and his family. And by family, I mean everyone in the community whose friends or family related to him. By segregation due to the white community.
Now, the civil rights movement's impact on America resulted in immense social change and was credited to the voices of protest. America had always been considered an international superpower, which possessed an identity as a land of liberty and opportunity. However, ironically, those very same natural rights were denied to African Americans who was on the same land for hundreds of years. The Civil Rights Act highlighted the realization that society needed to change their social standards in order to become a more progressive nation in a more united body. For the first time, discrimination in America was to be countered and efforts were being made to combat racial inequality throughout the nation. The success of the civil rights movement was largely influenced recent efforts, as many still seek equality in different forms. For example, in 2017, the world experienced a massive movement on social media called the #MeToo movement that targeted the prevalence of sexual assault and harassment in society. The #MeToo movement exploded on sites such as Twitter and Facebook after various sexual allegations were levied against famous Hollywood producer Harvey Weinstein. Even 50 years later, King's style of peaceful demonstrations is seen throughout the Me Too movement. But marching in the street is not the only way for people to communicate nowadays. Social media, TV, and the internet has allowed for messages like #MeToo to spread further and faster than before. Advocates of the Me Too movement flock to social media to exercise the freedom of speech and get their message out. Similar to how the civil rights movement dealt with segregation and helped colored people, the #MeToo movement focuses on helping women fight gender inequality and those who are abused. Another example of how those two movements are similar is the way they utilize growing media outlets as a way to spread their awareness for their movements. The civil rights movement utilized television to their advantage, as most of America was aware of Eugene Bull's brutality towards the peaceful protesters. People in the Me Too movement used the internet to spread awareness for their platform. Regardless of time period, people are voicing their opinions in order to create a society in which they are accepted.
The civil rights movement was effective because it was largely led through peaceful, nonviolent protest. The Birmingham March and the resulting letter from Birmingham jail show how those who opposed the civil rights movement were willing to use violence to stop the protesters. Yet, MLK and his followers always responded with only civil disobedience.
Next week, we'll talk about nothing. This is our only episode. Thanks for watching. Crash Course is written and directed by John Green. Our script supervisor is John Green. Our producer and executive producer, John Green. Our historian is John Green. Our editor is John Green. And the Thought Bubble creative team is John Green. This video is produced in memory of Jonathan Michael Green. Thanks for watching.
Hi, I'm John Green.
And I'm also John Green.
This is...
No, you're laughing.
No, that's good.
Oh my god.
It's funny. Just let it happen.
That's good. That's good.
Oh, aha! It is a letter from Birmingham jail by Martin Luther King Jr. Huzzah! You may well ask, why direct action? Why sit-ins, marches, and so forth? Is it negotiation? Stop! The civil rights movement was effective because it was largely led through peaceful, nonviolent protest. The Birmingham March. Stop!
What's your problem?
I hate you.
Steve,
Why?
what's your problem?
Hi, I'm John Green.
And I'm also John Green.
This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to look at one of the most
The most important thing about these protests is that they were non-violent. The genius of this plan revolves around the month that it was in. The march was originally planned.
Your glasses aren't on.
Oh my god.
Following the decision of Plessy versus Ferguson, Jim Crow laws were enacted to keep African Americans contained and restricted. White realtors could say no to aspiring black owners and... Oh, it's time for the mystery document. The rules here are simple. I read the mystery document. If I'm wrong, I get shocked. Let's see if my knowledge of civil rights holds up.
Robin, I can see you.
I tried to do the macaroni.
Yo, I was like biting back the urge to throw.
Hi, I'm John Green.
And I'm also John Green.
This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to look at one of the most infamous periods in U.S. history, the Jim Crow Law era, and the events that... What?
Are you serious?
Are you kidding me?
Next week, we'll talk about nothing. This is our only episode. Thanks for watching. Crash Course is written and directed by John Green. Our script supervisor is John Green. Our producer and executive producer is John Green. Our historian is John Green. Our editor is John Green. And the Thought Bubble creative team is John Green. This video
The civil rights movement was effective because it was largely led through peaceful, nonviolent protest. The Birmingham March and the resulting letter from Birmingham jail show how those who opposed the civil rights movement were willing to use violence to stop the protesters. But MLK and his followers always responded with only civil disobedience.
Next week, we'll talk about nothing. This is our only episode. Thanks for watching.
That's okay.
Ah,
Where did it start? Oh,
Give me
it's
a
you.
break. Yeah.